Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first day of the 2024 East Asia Youth Summit Forum. I'm Sarah Yang, one of the presidents of EAYS 2024 and a rising sophomore at Columbia University. I'm thrilled that we have this incredible opportunity to come together and explore the political, economic, and cultural aspects of East Asia, a region that has experienced remarkable economic prosperity and profound political movements over the past few centuries. First, I'm thrilled to share an opening remark from Tomiko Doggin, Senior Vice President of the Universal Peace Federation, and her wishes to our summit. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, and distinguished guests, and esteemed participants, both here with us in person and joining us online. Good evening and welcome to the 2024 East Asian Youth Summit. My name is Tomiko Dagan, the Senior Vice President of the Universal Peace Federation. I'm so happy to welcome you all today. It is truly an honor to stand before you at this prestigious event, which has been a long outstanding tradition dedicated to fostering research and understanding among high school and college students from around the world. The summit is a remarkable platform for young minds and explore, discuss, and engage with the rich and diverse culture of East Asia. Our summit aims not only to encourage academic research, but also to celebrate the vibrant cultures that make up East Asia. By delivering into the historical traditions and the modern dynamic of this region, we hope to promote a deeper understanding and appreciation of its people and their contribution to global society. It is our increasingly interconnected world. It is more important than ever we study different cultures and enhance our communication skills to promote and harmonious world. By understanding and respecting one another's background, we can work towards a more peaceful and cooperative global community. This summit serves as a beacon of hope and learning, guiding us toward a future where cultural exchange and mutual respect are paramount. Your presence, whether in person or online, is a testimony to the importance of this event and the shared commitment to building bridges between cultures. I'm immensely proud of the dedicated organizers who have worked tirelessly to bring this summit to life. A special thanks to the main youth team, Jeffrey Lin, Sarah Yang, Jack Wang, Cassidy Dang, Christina Wang, Henry Liu, and Elise Liu. Your hard work, passion, and dedication have made this event possible, and we are all deeply grateful for your effort. I would also like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our panelists who have dedicated their time and energy to share their passions and expertise with us. They are experts in their fields, and I'm looking forward to learning so much from them. I am also looking forward to the panelists by our youth speakers who have shown that academic passion and discovery can begin at any time. You are the leaders of the future, and we are so excited to see the contributions you will make to the future of academia. Thank you once again for joining us at our Youth Summit. Let us embark on this journey of discovery and dialogue together, and may we live here inspired and enlightened today, ready to contribute to a more harmonious world. Thank you very much.
All right, we extend our greatest thanks to Mrs. Duggan for speaking to us. Sarah, do you have any more comments before I do some housekeeping comments here?
So next, I'd like to introduce our organization. The East Asia Youth Summit is a student-run organization dedicated to reimagining East Asian history, as well as highlighting Asian culture, heritage, and voices. And thanks to the support from professors, scholars, and mentors, we now have been able to grow and thrive. So our team consists of passionate students from China, Hong Kong, Canada, United States, Japan, France, etc. And currently, we organize youth communication events in both community and academic settings, and we produce papers and projects to encourage East Asian youth and to engage with important issues. So now my co-president Jeffrey Lin will introduce some housekeeping notes about using the chat box and asking questions to speakers, please.
Thanks, Sarah. So as you know, this summit is being broadcasted through 3 channels, the first of which are your Zoom attendees here. Welcome. We also welcome our guests on Tencent Xiaotong live broadcasting. And finally, we have 60 offline attendants to which this recording will be distributed in the coming days. And for those of you on Zoom with us, I'll quickly introduce a privilege that you have, namely that during each session, if you have any questions you would like to propose to the speakers, please feel free to send them to me via direct chat, some of which I will hopefully relay to our dear speakers if time permits. Now, we moderators will also provide some guiding questions or food for thought in the chat box. And if you feel like you have an insightful answer, please feel free to drop it in the chat for the benefit of everybody. And thanks. I'll now pass it on to Jack Huang, the moderator of our first session on East Asia's ascent.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey. Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, professors and students. Thanks, Sarah, for introducing the event, and thank you, Ms. Tomiko, for the opening remarks. Also, thanks again to Jeffrey for the notification to our audience. My name is Jack Huang, the Vice President of EAYS 2024, and I will be the moderator for Session A. In this session, our topic is the ascent, where we will discuss political movements, policy makings, and community engagements in and outside East Asia. To start, let us go back to the 19th century, a period of major change for East Asia. The arrival of U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry ended Japan's shogunate period and kicks off the Meiji Restoration, leading to a rapid period of industrialization and military strengthening for Japan. Meanwhile, China was dealing with internal strife and external pressures. After the Qing dynasty fall, social unrest followed, leading to the Chinese Civil War and the establishment of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Deng Xiaoping's economic reforms in the late 20th centuries was key in turning China into a global economic powerhouse. In the 21st century, East Asia is still incredibly important and complex. Japan remains a technological and economic leader, while China seeks global influence and deals with internal challenges, namely environmental challenges and also sustainable growth. Studying East Asia is crucial for understanding global development and governance. The region's experiences offers valuable lessons in resilience, adaptations, and innovations that are very relevant today. So now, let me introduce the guest speakers for the session. To begin with, we are delighted to have Mr. Charles Argan with us today. Mr. Argan is a third-year PhD in Princeton who specializes in Chinese political history. After graduating cum laude from Princeton University with a Bachelor of Art in East Asian Study, Mr. Argan lived and studied in China for several years and completed a Master's of Art in Chinese History at Tsinghua University on a China government scholarship. Mr. Argan's research primarily focuses on governance under the Qing dynasty. In the past projects, he has studied how county magistrates and campaigning armies interacted with merchants and bandits. Mr. Argan also investigated neighborhood-level mutual responsibility system called Baojia. In the Qing dynasty, Baojia program was mandated by the imperial court and implemented across the empire by cash-strapped local governments. So now, let's welcome Mr. Argan to deliver his study. And if you have any questions in the presentation, please send the emails or send chat box to Jeffrey.
Thank you, Jack, for this introduction. And now that you've introduced me, you'll realize that my talk is not about my research. So You have to bear with me if it's slightly less
It's completely fine. It's completely
than
fine.
my research project would be. But thank you for being here. Good evening. I won't introduce myself again, but I'm happy to be here and talk with you about the ascent of East Asia. I'd like to thank the organizers for putting this together and inviting me. I'm very encouraged to see that all of you are here thinking and caring about the future of the region and trying to foster some intelligent dialogue between East Asia and the US. So I'll start sort of immediately here. You can see my slides, I hope.
Yeah, I can see it. Yeah.
There we go. So in 2019, I visited Gansu for the second time with my classmates at Tsinghua, one of whom is from the southern part of the province, Gannan. And as you probably, many of you know, Gansu is the poorest province in China. It benefits neither from coastal population density and consumption, nor from heartland industrialization, nor from frontier province subsidies from the central government. So we got off the train at Tianshui City, about 300 kilometers southeast of Lanzhou, as you can see on the map, and I was interested to see what there was to see. And we quickly looked around and saw a big electronic clock. So I didn't take a picture, but this is one such clock from Gansu from 2020. The one that we saw was about 8 feet wide and was counting down the minutes and seconds, not just the days. So it's easy to be glib about this, and indeed there have been many memes made about it, which I left out, unfortunately, the presentation. But in reality, the escape from poverty is obviously no joke at all. China and East Asia have witnessed the greatest alleviation of poverty probably anywhere in the world in the last 100 years. And so we can see this sort of looking at Asian Miracle, which is the longest string that Google will give you as part of the East Asian Miracle, which is sort of my topic for the day. So let's start with the obvious. The economic development of East Asia has been incredibly rapid and successful over the last 200 and especially the last 100 years. The so-called Asian tigers of Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan of the late 20th century were the poster children for a remarkable economic transformation in the region, which back in the 80s was called the East Asian Miracle. Today, China and Mongolia are solidly what is called middle income, while the rest of the region is probably the richest area outside the developed West. This probably now seems obvious to all of you, having grown up sort of after this happened, but 80 years ago at the end of World War II, many of these countries were seen as the most impoverished and backward places in the entire world. South Korea was about as poor as North Korea, and Singapore was poorer than Malaysia. Japan's economy had been destroyed by the war, and China had made only uneven economic progress in the 50 years since 1900. By contrast, after 1950, the progress was very rapid. So just sort of quickly, the GDP of China grew by some 20 times in this period. In Japan, it was even more rapid. And in Korea, it was even more rapid. So to put it simply, we could divide the economic history of the region since 1800 into about 4 phases, and I'll focus on one of them. The first, from 1800 to about 1880, was characterized by slow, if any, growth under the old regime. And the second, from about 1880 to about 1950, varying by country, was characterized by semi-colonial industrialization. While Japan managed to expand and use the raw materials from its new colonies to jumpstart its own industrial development, most of the region was colonized to some degree. The effects of this on economic development are, as you might imagine, a source of debate, although there is some evidence that the colonization did spur industrialization in some parts of the region. The third phase, the miracle, quote, quote, stretched from about 1950 to about 2000. And here, GDP growth accelerated from probably somewhere around 1% to, in many places, over 5%, or even close to 10%, which may not sound like much, but stretched out over several decades is a huge difference. This was the period when East Asia became a middle-income region, an alternative center of economic gravity outside of Europe and the United States. And since then, it seems to have decelerated, although we are still watching the future unfold, so there's a question mark here. So these are the numbers. You probably already had some idea of them, but it's worth putting us all on the same page a little bit before we sort of ask the interesting questions about what they mean. In the last few years, as the top Google results clearly show, the focus of our discussion has been on the slowing of growth in the region. And that has been the story for some time in Japan and Korea, and recently also in China as well. American commentators have pointed to Japan and Korea as harbingers of China's dim future: an aging population, high savings rates and chronic underinvestment, depressed consumer sentiment, and rising labor costs. But of course, historical analogies are dangerous. As one commentator I listened to recently said, never say a country is the next Japan. On top of this, Japan has now returned to growth. So rather than jumping on the bandwagon of pessimism, perhaps it's worth returning to the East Asian miracle to understand where elevated growth rates came from in the first place. To be a little schematic, I think we can lump the causes into three buckets: government policy, human capital, and geopolitics. I'll focus on China because that's the place I know best, but I'll try to compare some of the other countries as we go along. So we can start our story in 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party came to power with a mandate to support industrialization. Throughout the 1950s, they pursued famously land reform and collectivization, but they also made many accommodations for capitalists in order to keep the economy running. As collectivization was completed in the mid to late 50s, the government proceeded to funnel much of the excess gains from collective agriculture into industrial production in the cities, literally shipping the excess grain to factories in the cities where it would feed people who were producing industrial goods. This extreme redistribution artificially impoverished the countryside and contributed to the severity of the Great Leap Forward, but it also did succeed in increasing industrial output in the 50s and 60s. Like America and many other countries, China had something of a baby boom in the years after World War II, and the CCP capitalized on this demographic dividend, as it's often called, of having a large working age population by initiating numerous programs to ensure the health and productivity of these new workers. According to recent research, their efforts led to an impressive increase in life expectancy and a modest but noteworthy increase in standards of living under Mao. State-led industrialization, for all its flaws, did succeed to some degree. But in comparison with the rest of the region, China's growth was relatively slow in the 50s and 60s. So we could pause for a second and watch just a few seconds of this clip so that you could get a sense of the American sort of popular view of China from the period. This is Theodore White in a very famous at the time and notorious since documentary about China in 1967.
China, bloodiest and most terrible of all. An entire civilization blown apart.
So here we have, I think, a lot of the sort of classic Orientalist tropes mixed with the fear of communism that was so prevalent in America in the period. But it does speak to truly huge changes in economic and political life in China. Okay, let's get out of this. Part of the reason for that is a human capital differential exacerbated by the Maoist approach to education. So Hong Kong and Taiwan in particular experienced huge inflows of upper class business people and skilled laborers in the 40s and early 50s as the rich fled the communists. Japan had educated and trained a large class of professionals before and during the war, and most of them returned to the mainland when it ended. So for example, as you see in this slide, in northeast China, many of the chemists and biologists involved in germ warfare research during World War II returned to Japan after the war and led pharmaceutical and other healthcare companies. A major source of industrial production in the early PRC was the Northeast, where some Japanese technicians stayed and continued to hold key positions in coal mines and steel mills like Fushun, which has recently been written about, and is only now starting to run out of coal. So this sort of Japanese colonialism really kickstarted this industrial process in Northeast China. In China, many of the best institutions for higher education had been missionary colleges whose instructors left during or immediately after World War II. This and a larger brain drain had to be replaced by a new generation of red engineers, as they were called, but many of them had their technical educations cut short by the Cultural Revolution, as pictured in this slide about Tsinghua University. So in Taiwan, for example, an electrical engineer born in 1950 could have, by 1980, earned his PhD in the United States and returned to work in the nascent semiconductor industry, whereas in China, he would have still been in school, having had his education disrupted for some years in the late 60s and early 70s. The high tide of communist revolution successfully redistributed an enormous amount of wealth in China, but it also caused a huge amount of chaos, which set economic growth back in the country several decades. A third factor which mattered throughout this period was geopolitics. And this is a map of US military bases. You can sort of see where they clustered outside of Europe, especially in East Asia and particularly in Japan. Japan was briefly occupied by the US after the war. South Korea quickly became an ally and was likewise host to American troops during the Korean War. And Hong Kong was already sending many students to American universities in the 2010s. After the war in Hong Kong, that continued, giving Hong Kongers access to the best higher education in the world. Then the US embargoed trade with China, giving Hong Kong a privileged position in trade between the two countries. By 1963, the US was the largest source of foreign investment for the island. In the words of one scholar, quote, a non-democratic colony with low taxes and lax financial regulations, Hong Kong was at the center of pioneering the neoliberal financialized global economy. By the 1970s, it was, quote, Asia's leading coordination center for multinational commodity chains, spurring 600% growth in GDP per capita during that decade. The region was notable for its strong governments throughout the period. So in addition to the benefit of being part of a sort of global network of trade in which the US played an outsized role, I have tried to highlight these two other factors in the East Asian miracle of the latter half of the 20th century. So human capital and government activity. While third world, quote unquote, countries in Latin America and Africa were also actively trying to support industrialization, they were on the whole much less successful than the countries of East Asia. In addition to government foresight, which I do think was especially impressive here, another part of the reason for their success is undoubtedly the strength of education and the hard work of people in the region. But I hope that I've convinced you that, quote, Confucian values are not the primary reason for East Asian economic growth. Instead, I think we have to look also at Asia's place in the world during this period. While Japanese colonialism was horrifically violent and destructive, it did also promote some industrialization, especially obviously in Japan itself. And the post-war sort of commercial imperialism, as we might call it, of the US in every country except China helped supply education, training, and markets for both people and products. While the scale of Chinese growth is impressive, however you measure it, its speed was actually comparatively slow relative to the other countries of the region. So what does all of this have to tell us about the present and, if we might sort of hazard a guess, the future? Well, there's no guarantee that these three factors will continue to determine economic outcomes going forward. It may still be worthwhile, I think, to consider how they've influenced the past. First, the people of the region are better educated and wealthier than they've ever been. Taiwan holds a dominant place in global supply chains for key parts like semiconductors. China now generates more citations on its papers than the US. It has become central to research in nearly every field. And the economies of Japan and Korea remain very strong, even if they are growing more slowly. One index of this is automobile production, where now we have not only Toyota and Nissan, but also Hyundai and BYD as global leaders. And we can watch for a second this fun clip of BYD's new luxury SUV, which came out recently. You might have to watch slightly more than 10 seconds of it to get a feel for it, but I will leave you to do that on your own time. So, let's see there. The governments of these countries remain committed to growth, but it seems clear, at least to me, that they are less devoted to it than they once were. The CCP has downgraded the importance of GDP growth in its internal targets and its external propaganda, and decades of effort to kickstart growth in Japan seem to be finally bearing fruit, but one wonders just how successful they will be. So while growth in the region continues, it seems like it will not accelerate beyond 5% anytime soon. Finally, US-China relations remain a wild card, with the potential to upset not only bilateral trade, but also the privileged positions of the region's other countries in the US-led global economic order. So I'm a historian, and we are not in the business of predicting the future, so I won't try to do so. I will just conclude by saying that the extraordinary ascent of East Asia over the last 80 years has, I think, been the result of a certain constellation of historical forces, political, geopolitical, and social, and that it doesn't look like the future will simply repeat the past. You all, I guess, mostly Asian students studying the US, although maybe not like me, can think about the implications of this for your own lives. Do you want to return home to contribute to the growth of your home countries? Do you want to stay in America, where economic prospects remain bright, despite considerable social and political turmoil? What can you do to help sustain the trans-Pacific ties between the US and East Asia, which have been so important for the well-being of both places since World War II? I will leave you with those questions. Thank you.
Thank you to Mr. Argan for a wonderful presentation. At first, I was kind of shocked by what is gonna be the point argued in the presentation, because I don't know, because like the research that you have conducted, it seems to be quite different, but it's pretty interesting, and I feel like a lot of us have been too pessimistic. As me personally, I have seen a lot of videos online talking about the future, the unpromising future of Chinese economic. And I have a stereotype for what happened in the past of how China have developed from a chaotic with like civil wars to transform to a economic giants within 100 years. But that clearly has more than what I thought in the past, just because of like a Chinese citizen power and such and such. There are more factors that could influence it, and there are certainly more factors that influence what we are going to develop in the future. I think that's mainly the point here. Correct me if I'm wrong. So next, it's my honor to introduce Ms. Yilin Zhang, a DC statehood advocate and accomplished political strategist. With a profound understanding of the local political landscapes, Ms. Zhang has played a pivotal role in advancing the cause of statehood for Washington, D.C. Drawing on her rich cultural heritage and expertise in East Asian studies, Ms. Zhang has adeptly navigated the intersection of local and global politics. She advocates for equitable policies and forging alliances that underscore the importance of inclusive governance. Her work exemplifies the power of cross-cultural engagement in shaping a more just and representative political future for all. And now let's welcome Ms. Zhang to present her argument and hear what she says. If there's any questions, again, send it to Jeffrey, and he will summarize it and provide it to me in the next Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Jack, for that introduction. And thank you to the organizers for having me. I'm very excited to be here. And, I was very fascinated by Charlie's research. I almost forgot that I was up next. So hopefully I could do as good of a job as him. But today I'm going to be talking about a little bit of a different subject area. I'm not a historian, but I want to speak to my own experiences as a Chinese American living in Washington, D.C., and also someone who works in advocacy, issue-based advocacy, and as someone who has run for public office in D.C. So I want to give a very brief introduction of myself, and then I do have a video clip that I would like to show, and then a few slides. But in terms of my background, as Jack said, I was actually born in Beijing, and I came to the US when I was 3 years old. And as with a number of immigrant families coming from China at that time, my father came over to pursue his postgraduate degree. And at that time, we decided, that my mom and I would immigrate also to the US. So that's how we came. And I spent the better part of my youth in Michigan. So I'm originally from Michigan. And us Michiganders, we like to use the hand because Michigan is in the shape of a mitten. So we call that the mitten. And for undergrad, I studied anthropology. I was very interested and still am in seeing things through multiple cultural perspectives. And I think that's very important for this talk and for what many of you students will be pursuing later on. And I also studied international relations. And then after I graduated from the University of Michigan, I actually went and lived in Shanghai for a year. I completed a Fulbright fellowship, and I was doing research in a community hospital, and I was affiliated with the Fudan University School of Public Health, the Health Economics Department. And that was a very transformative time for myself because as someone who is both Chinese and American, I really got to live in China and speak the language. And my Mandarin did vastly improve, but I think it's actually since declined because it's been a number of years since then. And then after that, I worked in healthcare for a number of years. And then I have always wanted to do something related to public service, running for office. And I didn't really know how to go about that. But at that time, as Jack mentioned, I'm very involved in the DC statehood movement. So for those of you who don't know, Washington, DC is a city and it's not a state. We do have 700,000 people that live in Washington, DC, but and we have a higher population than the states of Wyoming and Vermont separately. But unfortunately, we don't have final oversight over our legislation. So we have a DC council, which was one of the positions that I ran for. And we, with our mayor and our DC council, we developed this legislation, which then goes to Congress, whom are individuals that we did not elect into office, and they have final say over all of that. And so that has a lot of repercussions, but that's something that I had been working on for a number of years and still. And so that's when I decided to run for office. So with that, I would like to show a clip. It's about a 2-minute video if the organizers have it. And it was developed during my campaign, and I'll speak a little bit about it after we show the clip. And just a little bit of background, when I was running, it was actually the start of the pandemic of COVID. So that was interesting.
I am a first-generation Asian American. I came to DC to build my career, where I spent the last decade working in healthcare as a consultant and a business development executive in the public and private sectors. I am proud to call myself a Washingtonian. It's where I want to raise a family and retire. My parents, who sacrificed a lot for me, taught me the importance of giving back. That's why it's important to me to fight for our most vulnerable Washingtonians who are often not prioritized in our policymaking. I want to fix our system so it doesn't fail on residents like Alice. Right now, our government isn't doing enough, and I want to change that. We are not addressing the homelessness crisis correctly. We need to streamline wraparound services in addition to providing stable housing for our homeless residents. It's a long-term investment we need to make if we want all our residents to be self-sustainable. We are trying our best to manage through this pandemic, and it's especially taxing to our small business owners who are struggling to keep their businesses afloat. It doesn't help that DC was shortchanged $750 million in federal COVID-19 relief funding, which would have contributed to test kits, hospital supplies, and helped our small businesses keep their doors open. Families will lose their homes, and people will lose their jobs if we aren't more proactive. The League of Women Voters and I have educated people across the country about why we need DC statehood. I have been fighting to achieve this for more than 2 years. We need voting representation because our children deserve to grow up in a future where elected officials listen to them and take action. I'm not running to enrich myself. I'm running because I believe a council member's only priority is to serve the community. Policies are created to protect and enhance our quality of life. If these policies are not being enforced, then who are our representatives really serving? Let's fight together to build a better future in Ward 2 and DC. It's time for real change. Vote for Yilin Ellen Zhang for Ward 2 DC Council.
Okay, thank you for showing that clip. So the things that I want you to take from this video is the reason why I ran was because as the child of immigrants and really as a 1.5 generation immigrant to this country, seeing my parents come to the US and really work very hard for what they have to make sure that I have more opportunities than them, that really inspired me to run for office. And I think for many of the students who are on this call today or will view it later, you know, even though whether you're here for a short period of time or you decide to make this your home, getting involved in the community, making sure that you have a say in what's going on is really important. And I think sometimes people get involved when something has happened that they don't like. But it's really important to constantly be involved because there really is one person has a lot of influence and has the ability to do that. So whether or not you want to run for office down the line or be involved, you can definitely make a difference in whichever field that you choose, whether it's politics, business, international relations. And then the other important lesson when I was running is that, you know, even though I'm talking about the American political side, a lot of the geopolitical tensions or the movements, the international relations, they really do have an impact on, for myself personally, running for office, because I was running during the height of COVID-19, the pandemic, and there was a documented incredible rise in anti-Asian American sentiment. And I directly felt that, whether it was verbally in person or online. And unfortunately for Asian Americans, there is a long history of this perpetual foreigner perception. And, you know, unfortunately, that is directed toward people who are, whether you're running for office or you're just taking a run down the street. Many of my friends and acquaintances really felt for the first time unsafe. And that's something that we cannot have happen again. So it's important to have a voice in these situations and make sure that we support one another, you know, whether it's hate directed toward the Chinese American, Asian American, or other communities of color. So that's part of the reason why I continue to do the work that I do, is that I feel it's really important to have people who look like me running for office. And unfortunately, there hasn't been many in DC who look like me who have run for the DC Council. But hopefully there will be more in the future. And after I ran, there were certainly I believe, a record number of Asian Americans running for advisory neighborhood commissioner positions. So really, when people see others who have a similar cultural background or just even look like them doing something that they felt was never for them or that they couldn't do, I think it really empowers people to do that. So I do have some photos here, and I just wanted to show you a collection of, the work that I do now. Ever since I ran for office, I did lose, which is totally fine because there can only be one winner. But of course, I was running for office is an interesting experience because it takes a lot out of you mentally, emotionally, and physically. And afterward, I actually didn't really know exactly what I wanted to do, but I did want to make a change in my career. I left my corporate job working in healthcare, and I decided to go and manage someone else's race. So that was a lesson that I learned, which was, even if I don't win or I'm not interested in running anymore, I certainly want to support other people. And so that's what I did immediately after. And I want to go back to, in the opening ceremony, Ms. Tomiko Duggan spoke about mutual understanding, respect for one another, cross-cultural understanding. That is so very important. And that is eventually where I found myself. So a while after I ran for office, I then started to go out on my own. I started my own advisory business. And I have been very lucky to work with a number of nonprofit organizations based in DC. And this photo that you have right here is one of the projects that I worked on with the Chinese American Museum in DC, which, if any of you are ever in DC, please let me know. I'm happy to give you a tour. And I also worked with the 1882 Foundation on this, but it was a conference highlighting Chinese American women in history. So we were really taking time to celebrate the achievements and the contributions of the many amazing Chinese American women who have worked in the arts, who have worked in other industries. But oftentimes, sometimes history is interesting because sometimes, it happens, but then if you don't talk about it, people don't know this history. So one of the important things that I look for in an organization is that they're highlighting the history that happened and the history that has been unwritten in some of our textbooks, because unfortunately, many of the public school systems, they don't have a curriculum teaching about the Chinese American history. So that's been something that has been really enlightening to me, because as an adult, now I get to see the full comprehensive view and understand that sometimes the selection in what is taught in schools is also subjective. So that's something that we want to push for, because we want people to be aware of our full history and what has happened. And that helps in building cross-cultural understanding. So this is one of the projects that I'm extremely proud of. And then if you can go to the next slide. This one, and then the next slide too, because the two are basically the same. So this was a project I worked on with the 1882 Foundation, which its name is very special, and I'll get to that in a moment. And we also collaborated with many different organizations, United Chinese Americans, OCA, Asian American Advocates, and a number of others. But the 1882 Foundation is called 1882 because it's named after the 1882 Exclusion Acts. And that was something that Congress put into play, which banned Chinese immigrants from coming to the US for 10 years and did not allow the Chinese residents in the US to become citizens during that time. So this was obviously a very discriminatory piece of legislation, and it's really the first time that Congress directed this toward a large group of immigrants. And so for that period of time, we had that basically stopped immigration from China. And we were celebrating back in 2023 the 80th anniversary of the repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Acts of 1882. And part of this project was I got to work with the representatives from the White House and many different other organizations. And so we worked together to get President Biden to issue this statement. And it was incredible because the statement came exactly on December 17th. And then we had Erica Mortsugu, who is the senior advisor to the president for Asian American affairs. And then she came and delivered this statement from President Biden. So these are the types of things that's why I think the US is really incredible, because as just a resident, a citizen, someone who lives in the US, you can do so many things. If you have a passion for something, an idea for something, and you go out there and you make the relationships and you want to get something like this done. So this is possible. So this is one project that I'm incredibly proud of. And again, I think this definitely ties to this summit here, which is really, as a nation and globally, we need more cross-cultural understanding. We need to make sure we work on diplomacy and to know that people are people and we have a lot of similarities. Of course, we have differences, but that should be celebrated. But also, I think for the students on this call is just knowing that what you do also at an international scale or from your home countries, that can have an impact on the people in another country. So I want to say a few more things, and then I'm going to wrap up with just some lessons. But one of the things that I have learned as I've been in the political sphere and the advocacy sphere is that there are so many connections to be made, and there are a lot of inspirational individuals out there. And yes, Asian Americans, Chinese Americans is a smaller percentage of the population in the US, but within the Asian American population, that's actually the fastest voting bloc in the US at this time. And there are a lot of incredible public servants that I look up to. And those include Congresswoman Judy Chu, who worked with us at this Library of Congress event, and she came and spoke with us. And she has been very supportive of efforts, making sure that Asian Americans are celebrated in the US. And we got to work with Congresswoman Grace Meng and other capacities, other projects, but she's also been very supportive, and she has been very vocal, especially during the pandemic and the height of anti-Asian and anti-Asian American sentiment. And of course, Congressman Ted Lieu is an incredible leader. And then locally, I've had the opportunity of collaborating on various projects with Delegate Lily Chi from the state of Maryland. And there's a wonderful professor at the University of Maryland specializing in Asian American Studies, Dr. Janelle Wong. So there's really just so many different individuals. And I hope that maybe the students on this call will be able to connect with the panelists, or if you're interested in a particular topic that you want to learn about or speak to someone about, definitely don't feel shy and reach out to people, because I think most of the time people really are willing to share their experiences and what they know. So with that, I guess I want to leave with just 3 things that hopefully you'll find relevant. And hopefully you found my talk relevant, which is really more so focused on my experiences running for office and also being a Chinese American in the US, particularly at this time. So the first thing I would say is, as you are pursuing your studies and deciding what you want to do after graduation, one thing that I have found really wonderful is just getting involved in the community. So whether it's getting involved in your school, or maybe it's even an off-campus organization, there are a lot of national organizations that have a student focus too, such as the League of Women Voters. We have a group that's focused for students, and we're very welcoming of students. We want them to be engaged early. So even if it's not necessarily a topic that you're interested in, you could find people that you really enjoy working with. And so that is a beginning. I generally find that I stick to things and organizations where there are people that I naturally gravitate to or have professional chemistry. So that is a great way to just get started, because once you get started, you can figure out what your passion is. You don't need to have all the answers at once. Then the other thing that I have learned in life is to be patient. And that is not a skill that I have. So that is something that I've had to really work on. But I really do believe that, historically speaking too, big things that you want to happen, they happen by taking one piece of sand and building a mountain basically every day. You have to keep at it. These big movements happen and the public thinks it happens immediately, but it really takes a lot of hard work and consistency to get these big accomplishments achieved. So I would say be patient in whatever you are pursuing. And then the last thing I would say is cross-cultural understanding. That's something that I have found to just be very important in my professional and my personal life. I think it's multicultural understanding, cross-cultural understanding, it's mutual respect. And that you can, unfortunately, people have biases, and to break that cycle, it takes these one-on-one relationships. So all of you have an important role where you make friends with different people from different cultures. You can teach them about your culture. They teach you about their culture. And from that friendship, that's what creates this larger scale cross-cultural understanding, global understanding. And that's what, as someone who is an optimist, I hope that we can do better at in the future. And that's something that we definitely need now. So I want to thank you again, guys, for listening. And I want to thank the organizers for having me. And I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Zhang. I feel like this is connected to what Mr. Argan had mentioned about what we can do, what individuals can affect the communities. I feel like although, like as Ms. Zhang have said, yes, Chinese American is just smaller group within America. They still make a lot of contribution, and that's what they are the one who primarily contribute to the mutual understanding between cultures. Due to time constraint, I am gonna hand the stage now to Jeffrey, who will be running the Q&A session and the next session. Thank every professor and everyone here for listening to the summit, and I hope the next session and the overall summit will be also enlightening and also mind constructing. Yeah.
All right, thank you, Jack. So we received 2 questions from the audience for this first panel on East Asia's and East Asians' ascent. So the first one has been proposed to Mr. Argan, namely that why has aging been such a troubling factor for limiting further economic growth in Asian countries after a period of boom? Is it really a lack of immigration, unlike that which the US possesses, or factors like outrageous living costs that has risen since those economic booms?
Thanks for the question. I think the person who asked it seems like they already sort of know the answer. And I'm not an economist, so I won't sort of speak with too much authority on this, but my impression is that it's a combination of limited immigration. I mean, immigration in most of the countries in East Asia is very, very tightly limited, and falling birth rates, which is for any number of reasons. I mean, a large one of which is, oh, now the cat is here, I'm sorry. The cost of education.
All right. It seems like Mr. Argan has been cut off. Our second question is proposed to Mrs. Zhang. The question was, did the special status of Washington, D.C. as the capital of the United States influence the obstructions or difficulties you faced on your path to office?
Thank you for that question. Well, when I decided to run, so I've been in DC for about 14 years now, and originally from Michigan, but as many in DC, I am a transplant, but I definitely consider Washington my home, and I absolutely love the city. It's I'm definitely a poster child for DC. I love DC. I love my neighborhood. I love the people here, and I've made it my home. I would say DC is definitely an interesting place because we like to talk about politics. And I guess we have a joke that everyone is running for office. And that is kind of true because, in the sense, we have a lot more people who are interested in running for office, whether it's local office or they're here for a few years and then they go back to their home state and they decide to run for Congress from their state. But we also have many positions that are these unpaid positions, such as the shadow senator roles or the shadow representative, because we're not a state. And those roles are quite competitive too. So I would say DC is an interesting place because people are super focused on, a lot of the power is local in terms of the small shops that set up or alcoholic and beverage licenses. And so a lot of people do get involved at the very micro local level, and people are very educated and aware of local issues. So for me, when I was running, as someone at that time, this was 5 years ago, I'd been here a little under 10 years, about a decade or so. I had to spend a lot of time just making sure I knew what I was talking about, and so that I could get people's respect as someone, so that they would see me as someone who was really aware of local issues and really cared about the community.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Zhang. It's a truly marvelous insight. And so, yeah, I would like to express my appreciation for Mr. Argan and Mrs. Zhang for speaking to us again on this wonderful panel A, which is called East Asia Sunset. And indeed, we have witnessed wonderful examples of the countries on an economic ascent and individuals striving for upwards mobility and involvement in society. And it's truly inspiring to all of us. And so, having completed the Q&A session as well for panel A, I would like to move on to the second panel, panel B, on weaving the webs. Now, as the name intuitively suggests, this panel is all about making connections, which is indeed a cornerstone spirit of our East Asian Youth Summit. Now, connecting the East and West, ancient and modern, younger and elder are all spirits to which we strive to attain. Indeed, East Asian studies is not an isolated, independent field. The East has felt the influence of other societies, among them Western nations, on a massive basis as early as the 2nd century BCE, when Zhang Qian first pioneered the Silk Road. Likewise, East Asia has exerted its fair share of cultural diffusion to the West in return. East Asia itself is an interconnected and, in many aspects, an interdependent ecosystem where culture, language, technology, and resources are constantly exchanged between its constituents. East Asian studies as a field amalgamates the disciplines of history, literature, language, international relations, and the social sciences, and more to explore the intricacies of this astoundingly complex and key region of the world. So now we seek to explore how these geographical spaces and dimensions of inquiry all come together in one giant web. Now, as the panelists present their thoughts and research on the topic, please enter any questions you have regarding their presentation's content in the chat box, some of which we'll again hopefully propose to our speakers in the Q&A session following. So now we will first welcome Professor Han Saucy from the University of Chicago's Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and in the Committee on Social Thought, who will now present on exile in Greek, Roman, and Chinese poetry. Professor Saucy writes on classical Chinese literature, poetry in particular, translation, and rhetoric, drawing on anthropology, deconstruction, and liberation theology. Three traditions which don't always mix easily. Now, examples from his extensive list of published books include The Problem of a Chinese Aesthetic, published in 1994, Great Walls of Discourse in 2001, The Ethnography of Rhythm in 2016, Translation as Citation, Zhuangzi Inside Out, 2017, and Comparative Literature in an Age of Globalization, published in 2008. Professor Saucy works on an ethnographic study of the NGO partners in health and its 11 international partner sites. So now I will yield to Professor Saucy from UChicago.
Thank you very much. All right, let me just launch some slides here. If I can find them here, there we go. All right, oops, but hold on. All right. Okay, let me make this a little bit bigger if I can for readability. And hit play. Here we go. Okay, so I'm somebody who is fascinated by East Asia, but also aware that there are a lot of other places in the world, and I suppose it's a curiosity about relationships and resemblances that keeps me working in this field. And so one thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit lately is migration and exile. Exile is an easier thing to talk about in earlier periods because it's a situation that mostly affected the small number of aristocratic people who were likely to offend a sovereign. Right? If you got into bad graces of the Roman or Chinese emperor, you might find yourself receiving an order of banishment. And of course, the question when you're doing comparisons across cultures is how to make things comparable, right? Because you might say, you know, such and such is the translation of such and such in that culture, but the closer you look at things, the more you will find that there are non-resemblances, non-equivalences. And actually, that doesn't mean that comparison is futile. It just means that we have to do it more intelligently and think about more things. Right? So it's actually a stimulus to thinking, just as if you're doing a scientific experiment and you get results you weren't expecting, that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing because that leads you on. So just to look at the terms here, when you talk about things like ostracism, which was a practice in ancient Greece, where if somebody began to accumulate too much power, the voters could put that person on a list. And if enough people voted to ostracize that person, then he, it was usually a he, would have to leave the city for a certain number of years before being allowed to come back, right? It was a way of counterbalancing the tendency of demagogues to acquire too much power. So that's a very interesting kind of custom. When you think of exile, right, like the exiles of different kings or princes in European history, the essential ingredient is a border on the other side of which you're in a foreign country, right? If you're a British exile, People who like the Shakespeare play Richard II might remember that it begins with a sentence of exile pronounced by King Richard II. The whole idea is that you're going to a foreign place where you're no longer under the jurisdiction of the king who's banishing you. But there are also political forms, big empires, where you don't really have much thinking about a border or about other states. In fact, a really big empire doesn't recognize the existence of external powers that are equal to it. So for that, you might want to think about terms like banishment as an equivalent of liufang, because when you're liufanged in traditional China, it meant that you were sent not to another country, but to an outlying, distant, generally considered less prosperous and less favorable region of the same empire. As I was thinking about this, I remembered this passage in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which is good to think with. He talks about how you might displease the emperor, and in a situation like that of the Europe of his time, of the 18th century, if you were unhappy in France, you could escape to England or to Switzerland. If you were unhappy in Germany, you could escape to Italy and so on, and there you would be under a different set of laws. But, Gibbon says, the empire of the Romans filled the world, and when empire fell into the hands of a single person, the world became a safe and dreary prison for his enemies. Right? There was no way to get out of the shadow of the emperor. Wherever you are, said Cicero to the exiled Marcellus, remember that you are equally within the power of the conqueror. That sends a chill up my back. It's a pretty gruesome situation, right? So the difference between exile and banishment is really the difference between the possibility or necessity of crossing a border and the impossibility of crossing a border. So one of the most famous people to be exiled in ancient Rome was the poet Ovid. He wrote a kind of a racy book called Ars Amatoria, The Art of Love, and the Emperor Augustus thought that it was pornographic and not good for people to read. So he sent him off to a remote colony on the shores of the Black Sea for the rest of his life. And Ovid wrote a lot of great poetry, very melancholy poetry in this terrible place in what is today Romania, where he had nobody to talk to. The food was bad, the weather was awful. There were no theaters or circuses or anything to go to. So he was quite miserable. And in fact, he died in his exile. But one of the poems that he writes in this collection called Tristia, or Sadnesses, right, laments, he says, well, you know, Caesar, if he wanted to just get rid of me, he didn't need the help of the gods, because Caesar owns me, right? This is very strange language for us who are used to the idea of people having certain civil and political rights, but that didn't exist in ancient Rome. And so Ovid, I think, shows himself to be, you know, a bit of a whiner and a weakling. I feel sorry for Ovid that he writes this very abject stanza where he says, Caesar possesses fully and in terms subject to none other's claim, my flesh. And what he has given, if he so wishes, he may take away. So on the scale of responses to exile, I put this very close to the level of utter desperation, but we've got some better things to think. The world, he is of course exaggerating, but to people in that empire, it felt like that, right? All the way up to Scotland on one end, all the way down to the Red Sea on the other end, you know, all the way to Babylonia. All of that was in Rome, and you couldn't really imagine getting outside of it. Or if you did, then you would be confronting people who would probably roast and eat you, or at least that's what the Romans thought. And similarly, the Chinese Empire, at its largest extent, was so big that it was very hard to imagine getting out of it. and it was ringed by other states with which it had a kind of political relation of subordination, right? If you went to Korea, you were still within the Chinese cultural sphere and the Chinese political sphere, right? They were considered tributary states. So the empire of the Chinese also filled the world as far as people during the imperial period were concerned. So here are some of the terms that we can think about when we're comparing the experience of exile in those two cultures, right? The sheer scale of an empire affects your way of living in it. The existence of boundaries and what kinds of boundaries they are. The whole point of exile is to send you out to the margins and away from the center. And that means being sent away from the capital off to the provinces, being sent away from the court to some kind of rustic place where you can't do the things that you like to do as a citizen of the capital, as a member of the court. And finally, the difference between the civilized and the barbarous. Right? The civilized are at the center, and the barbarians are on the outside. And to be sent off to live among the barbarians is really a miserable thing. That's how people see it. So, going quickly to a few examples. Xie Lingyun, one of the greatest Chinese poets, whose dates, as you can see, are 4th and 5th centuries of our era. He didn't do anything particular to offend a king, but his family, he had a very powerful and influential family. They had supported a different candidate for the emperorship of the Liaosong dynasty. And so the person who became emperor was worried that members of the Xie family might continue to push their power. So he banished as many of them as he could, including Xie Lingyun. So he sent him first off to a little town next to the sea where there was, basically nothing. And so Xie Lingyun starts by, he writes many poems in which he just expresses his depression and his loneliness, his longing to go back to the capital, very sad stuff, kind of like that passage of Ovid that we just saw. And there's one poem that begins with this depressed state where he's questioning himself, right? He's sort of in the middle. He's between the dragons who are down in the water and the geese who are up in the air, right? They're doing things, they're going places, and he's nowhere. And he says, I confront the sky, helpless to rise into the clouds, which you can read, allegorically to mean I am helpless to achieve any success in this life. I pause on the river's bank, startled by the depths, right? The idea of rivers connects maybe with the story of Qu Yuan, who threw himself into a river in desperation at being exiled by his king. So Xie Lingyun is definitely in a terrible state, and he questions himself, and he says, lying ill, I gaze on the empty woods. But as he gazes in the same poem, he begins to experience life differently. He says, with tilted ear, I listen to the surging of the waves. I lift my eyes and gaze on overhanging crags. New sunlight replaces old shadow, and so on. It's a poem then that shows him going around the corner. He will never go back to the capital, probably, but he begins to take an interest in the place where he is. It might be way off in the country, but there are natural beauties that he can enjoy, and he begins to describe them in language that creates a new poetic style. Right? Xie Lingyun is one of the great innovators in Chinese poetry because of his shanshui shi, right, his landscape poetry, which no one had been writing before that. He wouldn't have done it without exile. So here's a case of someone who begins sounding a lot like a victim and ends up creating something new and magnificent for which he's remembered. Forward ahead about 700 years, Xie Lingyun, Su Dongpo, right, also his official name, Su Shi. This is one of the last things he ever wrote. He was an outspoken political figure as well as a great poet, and he was constantly getting banished. We'll see the map of his successive banishments. But late in life, he was traveling and he stayed in a monastery where there was hanging on the wall an old portrait of himself, 30 or 40 years before, painted 30 or 40 years before. And he looks at this and he says, okay, what am I now? A mind like wood already turned to ash, a body like an unmoored boat. Those are two quotations from Zhuangzi. So you know that that they sound like bad things, but in Zhuangzi they're good things. They mean that he's really free. And I'll come back to his concluding lines here. I wanted first to show you the map of Song Dynasty China. So Bianjing is the capital, and Su Shi misbehaved, and he was sent to Huangzhou in what is basically Hebei there. He didn't learn his lesson. He again offended the emperor and his advisors, and he was sent down to Huizhou, close to Guangzhou today. He kept on acting up, and they finally sent him down to Hainandao, to a place called Danzhou, which was so far off the beaten track that this map of Song Dynasty China doesn't even include it. It was a totally wild place where nobody spoke Chinese, where the economy consisted of people growing tubers, right, growing yutol, and he felt very, very estranged at first. But he began to hang out with the local people. They had some alcohol that he appreciated, because Su Dongpo was always a guy for a party. And after 2 or 3 years, he wrote a poem. When he was finally permitted to go back to the capital, he writes a poem where he's sorry to leave. And he says, "Oban Hainan Min," right? I'm really a Hainanese person. Maybe I was born in Western Sichuan, but that was just an accident, right? And he says his exile was like Shi Yuan You, right? It's like carrying out a journey to the other world. And he says, life, death, and dreaming, I can never tell them apart. This episode in his life has been like a dream. He was afraid it was going to kill him, right? So in a way, his experience shows that life, death, and dream are not that different. And he says, I know we will never meet again. I must go, but I wish I could stay a while. And staying a while is actually a quotation from that old poem, Yuan You, about traveling to the realm of the gods. So if we have this in mind, right, his very distant third exile, this is astonishing that he didn't just give up. One of the reasons for sending him all the way down to Hainan, by the way, was that malaria was common there. So you were almost guaranteed to die if you were sent from the north down to the south. The mosquitoes would take care of you, and the emperor could say, well, too bad for him. Now, let's go back to this poem where he's thinking about his whole life. If anyone asks you, what have you achieved in this life? Well, 3 things. Hangzhou, Huizhou, Danzhou, right? These 3 places where he was exiled. These might be 3 enormous offenses, right? 3 indignities, 3 things to hide away and never mention to anybody, things to be ashamed of, but not if you're Su Dongpo. So on the scale that has Ovid cringing and groveling at one end of it, I would put Su Dongpo at the far other end of the people who simply cannot be broken and who take their exile as a badge of honor. This inevitably causes me to think a little bit about our current world and about changes in the way that international politics are organized. In a multipolar world, as I was just saying, right, like the world of the warring states, China, where if you got into hot water in the state of Qi, you could run over to the state of Lu and be better off, right? In that kind of world, which was multipolar, boundaries served a very important function, and people's lives could be different, people's careers could be different. In a unipolar world, where the people in power can always track you down and where there is nowhere else to go, to be banished to, perhaps, or to escape to, it's different. So I want to ask, where are people better off? And I think just by asking this question, I have to admit that I sort of know what answer I tend to tilt towards. My own family were refugees. That's how we came to this country. My wife's family were constantly fleeing different purges and actions in Soviet Russia. In our family, I think we are very sensitive to the plight of refugees and migrants. if you wanted to think, which is better, a multipolar world or a unipolar world, I like to think of John Rawls's great book, A Theory of Justice from 1971. And he offers the idea that you should judge possible political orders in this way. Ask yourself, would you accept to live in that political order if you didn't know if you were going to be a lucky person or an unlucky person, a rich person or a poor person? If you didn't know, then you would probably opt for the kind of world that would at least guarantee you a life that would not be totally miserable if you ended up on the low end of the scale. So adapting that test, I think, which is the form of life that might allow you the most options if you were so unfortunate as to get on the wrong side of the law and of the powerful. There we go. There's my talk, and I'll be happy to entertain questions about it. Now let me see if I can find the stop share button. There we go. All right, I think I found it. Sorry, my mouse is not showing up here. Let me just hit return there. Okay, now there we go. Boom, stop share.
Thank you so much, Professor Saucy. That was such a profoundly marvelous presentation on this theme of exile. And I'm truly taken away by what was being presented and read here. Thank you so much again. And so now we will move on to Mrs. Young Lee's presentation. Mrs. Young Lee will speak to us about Asian and American education systems. Now, immigrating to the United States with her parents in 1973, Mrs. Lee has built a diverse and impactful career. She has graduated from the University of Maryland in 1983, and since 1999, she has dedicated herself to education, serving as the director and coordinator for international students at private schools. In addition to her professional endeavors, Mrs. Lee has been actively involved in her community. She has served as the vice president of the Young Adults Group, a Sunday school teacher, and a choir member for the local Korean churches for the past 25 years. Thus, she is the perfect person to speak to us about Asian and American education systems, interactions between them, and specifically how Asian students thrive in the United States. Now I'll yield to Mrs. Young Lee.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this great summit. Yes, I am a director of international students for local private schools. I have been working with quite a few private schools in Maryland and Virginia. I was called to be a missionary, actually, a year before I got married. But God saw me not doing it, and I was running all over the place trying to make money and doing business. So what he did is he put me in the private school, Christian school, where I have to welcome the international students, rather than going out and reaching out. So I've been doing this for 25 years. If I can control this, stop. Okay. Yeah, next slide, please. I guess I'm going to have to just prompt it. Yeah, I'm a Korean. Next slide. But also American. Now, this is my family. I have 3 daughters and a husband. Okay, next slide. My daughter is, first daughter is in the U.S. Army. Second daughter is working for church. And third one is a forever student. She's an autistic child, and she's 33, and she's living with me. Next slide. And because I was called to be a director of the international students, I've been traveling a lot, and I went to Shanghai about 20 years ago for the first time. And a few years later, I was able to receive some Chinese students, and I got one student from Latvia. Actually, that student was supposed to be adopted by an American family, but they couldn't do it. So they had to bring him as a student, and now he's adopted and he's in college. So I have dealt with about 30 plus countries, students, and I've had Chinese students, Korean students, all Asian, European, African students from all over the world. Next slide, please. And I was able to, well, this is just short-term missionary pictures. We can go to the next slide. Help them out to settle down in USA. Well, actually, I start with the interview of the students and accepting applications and filter them through the interview and to see if they will come and settle and do well, not just for 1 year of study, but until they finish either middle school, high school, or even beyond colleges and graduate schools. And we need, this is the slide actually I use to educate teachers every year during summertime before we begin school. Next slide, please. And we have, like I said, I have had many students from different world. And the ESL is the classes, English as a second language, but I also describe as, okay, just keep pushing, enthusiastically serving and loving international students. This is my description. And they're the ones with the F visa or J visa students. And when they apply to school, I have to make sure that they can get the visa. Each country with a different relationship with the US government has different set of rules. I guess there's one set of rule from the US government, but depending on which countries we are bringing students from, they have little bit different rules and regulations. So we have to be very careful not to waste their time and money. When I interview, when I see all their paperwork, and if they can't get the visa, I usually discourage them to go forward. So I do the interviews and all the paperwork reviews. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I already mentioned that these students, they don't have a social security number, and they don't have all of them has foreign passports, and most of them have F1 visa, because J1 visa is a little bit different, and they usually come for 1 year. But F1 visa, we can have them until they graduate high school. And all these students have common needs. Number one, they have to we have to find their homes, because they do spend a lot of times outside of school. School has no problem. When once they're in school, no problem, because they have a lot of administrators, teachers, counselors, and they're taken care. But it's the homestay that's more important. So their needs, of course, is English, the reading and speaking part. They can actually read and comprehend more than speaking, because they did not, their lack of practice. And okay, let's just quickly go over to the next one. Okay, social studies, because of a lot of reading, it's they need a lot of help. Next. Okay, Bible. Okay, I work with the Catholic school and Christian schools, and most of them have no religious background, no Christian background. So Bible is a curriculum that they have to have every year. So this is really difficult subject for them. Next. Okay, and yeah, whenever they require a lot of reading, they struggle. Okay, next slide. All right. Okay, and so when they finish their school, we try to have after-school program where they can get and enhance their English skills and other subject matters where they have difficulty, they struggle. Okay, next slide. Okay, disciplinary action. Plagiarism somehow is okay in many countries, but it is really no in USA. So we have to really teach them, and a lot of people go through at least one warning because they say, oh, I didn't know it was not okay, but it is not okay in USA. And some attitude problems, behavior. Most of the students, especially from China, they're single child, and they're coming as a prince and princess's mind, and they have to be tended. So there's a lot of problem with their attitude, and American teachers are having difficult time in the beginning, but this can be corrected easily in a short period of time. Okay, let's just quickly go over, because I know I don't have much time. And respect, they usually have more respect. They show respect to teachers compared to other teenagers. But teenagers are teenagers, so throughout the world. Okay, next. Yeah, we can just quickly go over. And they're hardworking people, and they used to cheat when they used the electronic dictionary, so that we did away with it. And then body contact is allowed in most of the countries. It's Asian countries, boys hug boys without any problem. But some of these things are not allowed in US schools. Use profanity, and because they're usually in Christian schools. Okay. So we have to deal with all this disciplinary action with the students who comes, and it's usually taken care first year or first semester. Next slide. Yeah, and we're just going to skip this. Like I said, after school program, as necessary, we provide one-on-one or group help because they need all the help that they can get. Next slide. Yeah, TOEFL preparation and missed a field trip, because they usually come like 8th grade and up, and they have missed a lot of field trips. So we have to sort of make that up somehow. And as a director, I do the recruiting and do the admissions and counseling and outside school help, that the overall, like finding a homestay, good homestays, and transportation, picking up from the airport, and there's a lot of things involved, the A to Z. I've been taking care of that. Okay, next slide. Yeah, I have dealt with all these countries, like I said, 30 plus countries, and they have time differences. Go ahead, just keep going. They have time differences, sometimes, up to 12 or 14 hours. And the different food, different people group, different interest in sports. Educational system even is different in some of the countries, and we have to make sure that they get the credits that they deserve. And cultural differences, okay, between the two countries or continents. Some group of kids, they could be extroverted versus introverted, and all these different kids are being treated individually. And some students are very strong in individual work versus the group participation, because they're not used to having a group participation, and they're less creative because the way they studied is all kind of memorizing and just do the things that the teachers are telling them, and rather than being creative. And use of the middle finger for Koreans, that's fine. That's like using the index finger, but here it's no. So we have to teach them that not to do that. And answering with the yes and no sometimes can be confused. And eye contact with the adult, this is also different culture. In some countries, you're not supposed to look at the adults when you're talking. And here in America, when you don't look at the teachers when they're talking, they think that's disrespect. So, and bowing versus waving hands, different form of speeches, and show respect in different names. Like in Asian countries, you put sirs and ma'ams, which they don't do it here. So there are a lot of different cultural differences, and we have to go through that. Again, these things can be corrected within a semester or sometimes within a month. and they learn from the mistake. Yeah, so this is kind of things I do as a director of international students, and like I said, I started to have Chinese students about 15 years ago, and it was just almost like an exodus. So many Chinese students wanted to come, and the parents wanted to send their kids, but with the COVID, all of a sudden, this whole thing kind of died down a little bit. But then now it's another wave of students trying to come to study in USA for whatever the reason, different reasons. When I interview them, I make sure that they are committed to at least graduating the high school. But most of them will go beyond high school and go onto the next level, which is colleges and graduate schools. Well, if you have any questions, again, thank you for having me. If you have any questions, just put the chat questions on the chat and contact the sponsor. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Lee. That was wonderful insight because, as we know, pertaining to this theme, international students are the modern age's carriers or agents of cultural diffusion, and they really help form a bridge over the gap between what are two very seemingly disparate continents. So thank you again for the insight. And this concludes the presentations for today. Of course, we still have an optional Q&A session for those who wish to remain. I do acknowledge that we have just passed the 10 p.m. mark, which marks the end of panel B. So those of you who may need to go, please feel free to do so. We really enjoyed your presence today. We also want to acknowledge our 300 plus viewers currently on Tencent Xiaotong, who is on live stream watching our professors share their really amazing research. So now we'll move on to the Q&A section for those who would like to listen and remain. So we have gathered two questions, both of which I think are really sharp. The first one was directed towards Professor Saucy. So the speaker was saying that Xie Lingyun extensively describes the nature of the space to which he was exiled in his poems. I recall that he says, reanalyze virtue, I lacked intelligence. But then Xie Lingyun realizes that new sunlight replaces the old shadow. And Ovid, in comparison, reflects directly on the conditions of his banishment in relation to Caesar. So I wonder what Xie Lingyun's more circuitous or descriptive approach reflects about Eastern versus Western literary practices. Now, this question has been rephrased by me a little bit, but yeah, that's the gist of it.
Yeah, I don't know if it really says anything about East versus West. I think it shows Xie Lingyun taking a different attitude about the situation he's confronted with and turning it from a situation of desperation and no hope into something else. Now, the thing that is cultural about it might be that in Chinese culture, there were figures like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi who specialized in this kind of reversal, right? Where the high, in fact, is weaker. Paradoxical thinkers in mind probably helped Xie Lingyun to turn his situation around. That would be my quick reply anyway.
All right, thank you, Professor Saucy, for your insights. The second question was directed to Professor Hashimoto. So the speaker says that reflecting on how in the first story presented specifically, there was a Japanese character who was in Philadelphia of the US, listening to the reminiscences of the Jin court. And it reminds the person who asked the question of how Japan was a society which refined itself by learning from the merits of other societies. And I guess her question was, to what extent did you believe that this first book that you're presenting accurately presents Japan as a frontier of convergence for American and Chinese cultural influence?
Thank you for the question. I don't think of that work as I haven't thought of the work as such, but certainly it can be understood as a kind of a kind of a point of convergence, right, of the Western civilization and some remnants of the Chinese civilization. And through these convergences, this author really thought really hard about the path forward for the oppressors, actually, of Western imperialism. And these two women characters are actually from Ireland and Spain. And there is also a character from China that emerged in the novel later. So these are really the characters of the oppressed, right, of the modern world, really back then plagued by Western imperialism. And how are they going to forge solidarity across cultures based on, actually, according to this author, a common knowledge of classical Chinese poetry, classical Chinese literature, Confucian classics. So if you think about it, it's such a wild kind of imagination to think about a new world based on the values of the classics. But yeah, I mean, it really is, a site. This novel becomes itself an imaginary site, for such convergences, geographically, historically. Yes.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Hashimoto. So I think that concludes the questions and answers. Oh, Professor Saucy has his hand up. Yes, Professor.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little note to Satoru's wonderful presentation, which is that when it's viewed by these people coming from far away, the meaning of Philadelphia and the Liberty Bell and the Declaration become different, right? It's no longer just an American story. America becomes an example. And that would be a very, very strange and new perspective, I think, if Americans at the time had the opportunity to read that text. And anyway, that gesture seems to me very provocative and interesting.
I know. I'm also wondering, how the current students from abroad, coming to the U.S. as the work of the second Ms. Lee, right, presented would think of, when they look at the Liberty Bell, the Independence Hall, they read the Declaration of Independence. What imaginations do they get, from these things, and what example, do they make out of this history is also a very, I don't know, fascinating, thing to know. Yeah. So things really do not, monopolize their meanings themselves, right? Yeah. The meanings are made by people coming to them from all sorts of different places. So that really is such an important, interesting, aspect of human culture.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, professors. Those are truly insights I haven't thought of before. And I believe it has helped many others present, whether here or through the live stream, which now has 451 viewers, gain further understanding of how this world is one giant web, of which East Asia is such a fascinating constituent. Thank you. Thank you again. And we also, at the same time, thank all the viewers for sticking with us. And we really hope that you all return to tomorrow's sessions from 8 to 10, and where we'll also feature amazing speakers and presentations and even more opportunities for you to engage with our speakers, as we'll have more free time tomorrow for viewer engagement. And with that being said, I think that concludes today's two amazing panels. Thank you all, and please feel free to log off. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to stay behind. I can help answer all of them. And yeah, have a good one, everybody.
Thanks for everyone.
Thank you. Is the protagonist's name, climbed Independence Hall in Philadelphia and looked up to observe the cracked Liberty Bell and down to read the Declaration of Independence. Profound emotion welled up as he recalled the nobility of the American people who had raised the banners of righteousness and removed the tyranny of the British king, successfully becoming an independent, self-governing nation. So this is the reference to the American Revolution. Deeply moved, this protagonist was looking out the window when two women suddenly climbed upstairs. So he sees two other characters of the novel. Overhearing the conversation between the two women, the protagonist, Sanshi, wondered why these elegant, beautiful women living in a country of freedom and enjoying the benefits of civilization had to express such pressing regrets and sorrows. And he perceived something. They sounded reminiscent of the situation in the final days of the Jin court when Wang Dao had gathered with his people at the new pavilion and looked up to feel indignant at the sight of alien mountains and rivers, vainly shedding the tears of the true hostages wearing southern crowns. Sanshi could not but feel suspicious. If you know Chinese history, this is a reference to the relocation of the capital of the Jin dynasty from the third, which existed from the 3rd to 5th century, from the western part of China in Luoyang to the southern eastern part of China in Jiankang, and reference to this experience of rebuilding the Jin dynasty at a new, very unfamiliar location in southeastern China. So I would probably imagine you asking why ancient Chinese reference in this political novel, trying to introduce, cutting edge ideas from the West, like democracy, civilization, freedom, to the Japanese audience in Meiji Japan, right? I think these are pretty good questions for you to ask. And with that, I'll move to the second case, which is Shin Chae-ho from Korea. He is he was also born into a family of scholar official background. He was born in 1880. Also towards the end of the Joseon dynasty, he was educated under the auspices of his grandfather at a village academy that provided education in Confucian classics. he was regarded as a very smart boy, prodigy by many accounts. He was sent to Songyungwan, or the highest Confucian academy in Chosun, Korea, which was actually by his time reformed into a institution of modern higher education towards the end of the 19th century. And in 1905, he was conferred the highest degree from this institution called Paksa. Yet it was the year, Korean history, of the Ulsa Treaty, the treaty between Japan and Korea, which by which Korea lost sovereignty in diplomacy and other areas. So really the beginning of Japanese colonization of the peninsula. So he thought he would not remain in this high educational institution and moved the place for his activity to the modern publishing world. He was involved in the editorship of some of the earliest modern newspapers to be published in Korea, such as this one, Taemail Shinbo. And he made his name as a champion of nationalism for Korean people. And especially in the area of historiography, he is famous for his advocacy or championship of this new way of writing history that we know as national history. So he says something like modern historiography must first present the people who are the masters of the state and then break the stubborn dream of the entire country by virtue of nationalism, and forge new brains for the youth by virtue of the idea of statehood. In 1910, when Korea was finally colonized by Japan, he went into exile in China and participated in the establishment of the provisional government of the Republic of Korea in Shanghai. He was a very important member of it. But eventually he parted ways from the mainstream of this provisional government and further went into exile, I would say, into northern part of China, Beijing, and northeast China as well. He published journals to express his opinions against the mainstream of the provisional government in exile in China, and increasingly espoused the ideas of anarchism back then, which was an idea very popular actually in East Asia in the 1920s and 30s. And so the second quote I'd like to call your attention to is an unpublished kind of allegorical story Shin wrote in exile when he was enamored by this idea of anarchism. And this is a story about the battle between two dragons, which is an allegory of the kind of a final battle between the oppressors, right, consisting of emperors, kings, capitalists, all these powerful people in the world on the one hand, and on the other the oppressed, right, the people, right? And this story describes how the battle unfolds, and finally the people win, right? And so towards the end of this story, there's a passage where the post-revolutionary world, right, the ideal world that he envisioned that is to emerge after the anarchist revolution. right? This post-revolutionary world is observed. So the angel, and from the perspective of the character called the angel, who is the agent of God, and God here being the leader of the oppressors, and the angel observed the world as in this quote. The angel arrived in Beijing in China. So this angel observes Europe at first and see how people were liberated, and then he comes to the east, right, and then comes to Beijing and see what's going on. The angel arrived. This is again the post-revolutionary world, right, in Beijing in China, and passed over the altar of heaven among pine trees about 10 miles out of the Zhengyang Gate. There he saw spectators gathering to watch the great emperor of the great state of the Qing, wearing the Miandiu crown and Guanrong robe, celebrating the festival of heaven. So this is a scene where angel thinks that, oh, there's still the state ritual, right? The imperial ritual of the festival of heaven going on, and people and the emperor, someone who seems like an emperor, is still wearing all these, crowns and the crown and the robe of which are the attributes, traditional attributes of the Chinese emperor. So the angel says, aha, China is still a sacred country. It has reinstalled the emperor and revived the ritual of the festival of heaven, right? And then he looked around for the god, but someone comes and conspicuously opened his hand and said to the angel, "Stop dreaming, man. This is the theater for people's holidays. What god are you talking about?" And the angel had the cheek slapped again, playing the role of God's loyal subject. The angel cannot forget about swollen cheeks. So actually, what looked like an imperial ritual was a sort of a popular parody of it, right? For the sake of the people's holidays, right? Theater for people's holidays. And if you think about it, this is a vision of a world after the most radical revolution that he could imagine, right? And still, there's something going on in this world that resembles really the one of the most important imperial rituals of traditional dynastic China, yet as a parody, right, by the people. So what is the significance? What is going on here? I think it's another good question to ask. If I have time, I have the third case, which is Zhou Zuoren. He is known as the young brother of Lu Xun, one of the most important writers from modern China. He, together with Lu Xun, received Orthodox Confucian education from China. Skipping a little bit, and then he went to Japan in 1906 to study, enrolled in Rikkyo University in Tokyo, and to study English literature and the Greek language. He later was very much became very close to writers from Japan, and then his career during the Second Sino-Japanese War was quite controversial because he quite ostensibly collaborated with the authorities of the Japanese empire occupying China. But what I would like to call your attention to, so this really adds another complexity to the legacies of this figure, Zhou Zuoren. What I would like to call your attention to is what he wrote during the time of the new cultural movement, culminating in the May 4th movement, which is, of course, the anti-Japanese, anti-imperial movement, nationalistic movement in China in the aftermath of the World War I. And he wrote something like this in 1919, the very year of the May 4th movement. Before the Meiji Restoration, Japan learned many things from China and nourished a Confucian country, causing all sorts of harm to family and society. After the Meiji Restoration, it learned things from Germany and nourished a statist country, bringing about many different kinds of damage domestically and internationally. Now that these two teachers, China and Germany themselves, have collapsed, remember this is after World War I, what will Japan do? Will it still collect scrap materials in their ruins to support the old building? Will it instead seek a third teacher and learn to rebuild? For the sake of the interests of the people of their neighboring country and those of their own, I hope and indeed I believe that Japan's new people will follow a peaceful and just path. The third teacher will be able to lead humanity to build a third land or heaven on earth, where human life will be realized. Japan and China doubtless share the character and opportunity to enjoy this happiness. So remember, this is written at the height of the May 4th movement, which is really anti-Japanese, anti-imperial movement. What third path Japan and China commonly share, right? What civilizational view is presented in this quote? Why Japan and China together, right? And where is Chinese nationalism, right? So all these questions inevitably emerge from this quote. Just a little bit of a concluding thoughts. So we have really touched upon unlikely entanglements between East Asian literatures and imagination that are difficult to assess in a usual nation-based perspective. And we're really bound to ask, what are their significance? What's wrong with our usual perspective that may often fail to understand them? How might these instances change our understanding of the nations, the region, and the world? What modernities do they envision? And so the final message I'd like to convey is really that there are many, many more instances like them, that call on us to expand our approaches and imaginations. There's so much more left for new kinds of studies of East Asian literatures and cultures. Okay, thank you so much. And I would welcome any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Professor Hashimoto. So this concludes the presentations for today. Of course, we still have an optional Q&A session for those who wish to remain. I do acknowledge that we have just passed the 10 p.m. mark, which marks the end of panel B. So those of you who may need to go, please feel free to do so. We really enjoyed your presence today. We also want to acknowledge our 300 plus viewers currently on Tencent Xiaotong, who is on live stream watching our professors share their really amazing research. So now we'll move on to the Q&A section for those who would like to listen and remain. So we have gathered two questions, both of which I think are really sharp. The first one was directed towards Professor Saucy. So the speaker was saying that Xie Lingyun extensively describes the nature of the space to which he was exiled in his poems. I recall that he says, reanalyze virtue, I lacked intelligence. But then Xie Lingyun realizes that new sunlight replaces the old shadow. And Ovid, in comparison, reflects directly on the conditions of his banishment in relation to Caesar. So I wonder what Xie Lingyun's more circuitous or descriptive approach reflects about Eastern versus Western literary practices. Now, this question has been rephrased by me a little bit, but yeah, that's the gist of it.
Yeah, I don't know if it really says anything about East versus West. I think it shows Xie Lingyun taking a different attitude about the situation he's confronted with and turning it from a situation of desperation and no hope into something else. Now, the thing that is cultural about it might be that in Chinese culture, there were figures like Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi who specialized in this kind of reversal, right? Where the high, in fact, is weaker. Paradoxical thinkers in mind probably helped Xie Lingyun to turn his situation around. That would be my quick reply anyway.
All right, thank you, Professor Saucy, for your insights. The second question was directed to Professor Hashimoto. So the speaker says that reflecting on how in the first story presented specifically, there was a Japanese character who was in Philadelphia of the US, listening to the reminiscences of the Jin court. And it reminds the person who asked the question of how Japan was a society which refined itself by learning from the merits of other societies. And I guess her question was, to what extent did you believe that this first book that you're presenting accurately presents Japan as a frontier of convergence for American and Chinese cultural influence? Thank you. Thank you again. And we also, at the same time, thank all the viewers for sticking with us. And we really hope that you all return to tomorrow's sessions from 8 to 10, and where we'll also feature amazing speakers and presentations and even more opportunities for you to engage with our speakers, as we'll have more free time tomorrow for viewer engagement. And with that being said, I think that concludes today's two amazing panels. Thank you all, and please feel free to log off. If you have any questions, of course, feel free to stay behind. I can help answer all of them. And yeah, have a good one, everybody.